In political psychology, the collapse of power rarely begins in parliament, on the battlefield, or in the streets. It begins in the mind. A regime can appear strong from the outside: military parades, loyal courts, controlled media, carefully staged speeches. But history repeatedly shows that the most dangerous phase of power is not when a leader is weak. It is when a leader is terrified of becoming weak. Tonight, I want to take you into that psychological territory. This is not merely a discussion about politics. It is an examination of what happens when fear, isolation, and obsession begin to consume those at the top of power structures. Because across different countries, different ideologies, and different eras, collapsing leaders often display the same psychological signals long before their systems finally break apart. And one of the clearest signs is surprisingly modern: the inability to stop fighting reality through social media. Imagine the scene. During the day, tens of thousands gather in the streets. Crowds chant for accountability. Economic anxiety grows. International pressure increases. Even allies inside the government begin quietly distancing themselves. Outwardly, the leader still projects confidence, but psychologically something else has already begun. Sleep deteriorates. Suspicion intensifies. Every criticism starts feeling less like disagreement and more like a threat to survival itself. Then midnight arrives. The phones begin glowing in dark rooms, and the leader starts posting. Political psychologists do not see this merely as a communication habit. They often interpret it as a compensatory mechanism, a desperate attempt to restore the illusion of control, when real control is slipping away. Because reality is stubborn. Reality cannot be instantly silenced. Reality cannot always be manipulated. But online spaces create a dangerous substitute reality. A leader posts an angry message attacking critics. Within minutes, loyal supporters respond. "You are the only one telling the truth. We stand with you. The enemies are trying to destroy the nation." And suddenly, psychologically, something changes. In the real world, protests continue. Institutions weaken. Pressure increases. But online, the leader still feels powerful, still obeyed, still feared, still central. This is where the psychology becomes deeply important. Human beings struggle far more with uncertainty than with conflict itself. The unknown is psychologically unbearable. When people cannot clearly identify what threatens them, anxiety grows exponentially. And so the mind begins searching for something concrete to blame. This is why collapsing power structures often become obsessed with creating enemies. At first, the threat feels vague. Is it the media? Foreign influence? Students? Opposition parties? Economic conditions? Internal betrayal? The uncertainty becomes psychologically exhausting. Then social media offers relief. A leader identifies a target. This journalist is spreading lies. That activist group is undermining the country. These outsiders are sabotaging our future. And immediately, anxiety transforms into anger. That transformation matters enormously, because anxiety paralyzes people. Anger mobilizes them. From a psychological perspective, creating enemies is often less about ideology and more about emotional survival. The leader no longer has to confront the terrifying complexity of reality. Now there is a simple explanation: a villain, a traitor, an enemy. And once that process begins, the system escalates quickly. Individual critics become dangerous groups. Groups become threats to national survival. Eventually, punishment itself becomes framed as patriotism. History has shown this pattern repeatedly, not because all leaders are identical, but because human psychology under fear often behaves in predictable ways. But there is another layer beneath all of this, and it may be the most dangerous part of all: dopamine. Modern neuroscience tells us that the human brain is deeply shaped by reward loops. Social media platforms amplify those loops with terrifying efficiency. A leader posts a provocative message. Supporters flood in with praise. The brain receives reward signals. Dopamine rises. The experience feels emotionally stabilizing. Then criticism appears. The leader responds aggressively. Supporters celebrate the attack. Again, Dopamine. Again, reward. Again, emotional reinforcement. Over time, a cycle emerges. Receive support. Feel relief. Attack critics. Feel powerful. Escalate conflict. Feel emotionally validated. At that point, social media stops being a political tool. It becomes psychological medication. And this is where judgment begins collapsing. Because eventually, the leader is no longer asking, "What is good for the country?" Instead, the subconscious begins asking, "What will produce the strongest emotional reward?" That distinction changes everything. Policies become impulsive. Language becomes more extreme. Decision-making becomes increasingly emotional rather than strategic. And perhaps most dangerously, reality itself starts becoming negotiable. One of the oldest warnings in human civilization appears in the Tibetan spiritual text, commonly known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead. It contains a haunting insight. The moment a person mistakes their own illusion for reality, they become spiritually lost. Political power is no different. The final stage of collapsing authority often begins when leaders stop responding to reality and begin responding only to the version of reality that protects them emotionally. At first, they manipulate narratives intentionally. Later, they begin believing them. That is the turning point. Because once power isolates itself inside emotional fantasy, criticism no longer feels informative. It feels hostile. Truth becomes betrayal. Facts become attacks. And loyalty becomes more valuable than reality itself. This is why some leaders grow harsher as resistance grows larger. Why international isolation can make them more aggressive rather than more cautious. Why public anger sometimes intensifies their emotional need for control. To outside observers, the behavior appears irrational. Psychologically, however, it follows a tragic internal logic. The more unstable reality becomes, the more desperately the mind seeks emotional certainty. And in the digital age, social media offers that certainty instantly. But it is artificial certainty, a simulation of control, a theater of validation. And like all addictions, it eventually requires stronger doses, more outrage, more enemies, more emotional escalation, until finally the system begins collapsing under the weight of its own psychological distortions. The terrifying part is this. By the time these signs become visible publicly, the internal collapse often began long before. The sleepless nights, the paranoia, the narrowing circle of advisors, the obsession with enemies, the emotional dependency on applause. These are not signs of confidence. They are frequently signs of fear, and history repeatedly reminds us that frightened power can become far more dangerous than weak power, because leaders who fear losing control often become willing to destroy institutions, divide societies, and redefine truth itself, simply to avoid confronting their own psychological collapse. In the next lecture, we will go deeper into the second phase of this process, how sleep deprivation, emotional exhaustion, and isolation gradually destroy judgment itself, and why leaders trapped inside closed systems often lose the ability to distinguish reality from self-created illusion. If this lecture gave you a new perspective, consider subscribing, sharing, and joining us for the next chapter in this psychological exploration of power, fear, and collapse.